Admiral Threx had seen it all across his many years of service, the victories and defeats of countless alien civilizations, the rise and fall of empire civilizations that claimed they were unbeatable in their technology and knowledge, yet Threx had come to realize that no matter how advanced they were, there was always something more unpredictable lurking at the edge of every battle, and that thing was humanity. He had come to observe the humans, not their generals or their soldiers, but their children as they trained in simulators meant to test their resolve and their strategic thinking. But even he couldn't deny the lingering skepticism deep within his mind as he stepped onto the human warship, prepared to see what kind of species would place their young ones in such environments. The room he entered was brightly lit and sleek with technology far beyond what he had expected from a species so new to spacefaring life. In the center of the room was a child, a human no older than 10, sitting at a console surrounded by holographic displays and panels of light, as though it were nothing more than a game. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, and though he had seen countless species engage in simulations, it was the child's absolute calmness that sent a small jolt of uncertainty through him. Humans were known for their passion, their unpredictable nature, and their emotions so raw, yet this one was calm, too calm. The Admiral took his place quietly at the observation station and watched as the child began the simulation. His thoughts were already beginning to form into patterns of mockery, prepared to dismiss the human's actions. But as the first wave of enemies appeared on the screen, all those thoughts froze. Threx had expected the child to hesitate, to show signs of confusion, to at least act like a novice in the face of an overwhelming situation. But instead, the human moved with the precision of a seasoned captain, his fingers tapping across the controls with a kind of practiced expertise. The child's movements were measured and deliberate as the ship smoothly adjusted its course, weaving through incoming fire like a creature instinctively dodging a predator. The more Threx observed, the more unsettled he became. The ship was moving with purpose, not like a toy being controlled by someone testing it for the first time, but like a real force of nature operating in battle. Each command the child issued, each moment of strategic analysis, was filled with intent. It became clear to the Admiral that this was no ordinary child. The human had a level of focus that seemed impossible for one so young. The simulation grew more intense as waves of simulated enemies attacked relentlessly, and still the child didn't flinch. The ship dodged the attacks and returned fire with strategic precision, targeting weak points of the alien ships and quickly overwhelming them, as though the child had been playing war games their entire life. Threx watched as the child took risks, moving into unpredictable patterns to confuse the enemy ships, and using maneuvers that caught even the Admiral off guard. It was clear now that what he had assumed would be a training session for a child was turning into a display of raw instinct and skill that only the most seasoned warriors could achieve in real combat. Threx had thought this was going to be a simple observation, but what he was seeing now was something more profound, something that made him question everything he knew about humanity and its potential. He had been wrong to think of this as a game. The human child was not playing. They were showing him something far deeper than he had ever imagined. The simulation moved forward, and with it came the emergence of more enemy ships, far more powerful than the previous wave. Threx's eyes narrowed as he expected the child to falter. Surely the pressure of an overwhelming force would break through the calm exterior. But instead, the human child sat unmoving, fingers dancing across the controls with the same methodical precision as before. The ship's engines roared to life, and it shot forward into the chaos with reckless speed. Threx watched as the child's ship dodged incoming blasts, barely avoiding destruction. But instead of retreating, the child pushed forward, gaining speed and momentum, as if daring the enemies to come closer. The Admiral could not help but marvel at the child's instinctual grasp of battle, the way they responded to every movement with a grace that most seasoned pilots lacked. The child's hand on the control panel was steady even as the battle raged on around them. The first enemy ship fired, and in response the child didn't hesitate for a moment, adjusting the ship's trajectory just enough to avoid the blast, yet still within range to fire a return shot. The enemy was caught off guard as the human child's ship delivered a perfect hit, causing a chain reaction in the enemy vessel, sending it spinning out of control. Threx blinked in disbelief. It was not the way he had expected the child to fight. It was not the way anyone would expect a novice to fight yet. It was beautiful in its simplicity and deadly in its execution. The simulation threw more enemies into the fray, and yet the human child moved like an experienced warrior, weaving through their attacks with an agility that defied reason. Every move seemed to flow into the next, with a level of anticipation that told Threx this child wasn't just reacting to what was happening, they were predicting it. They understood the battle before it even unfolded. He had never seen anything like it in any species. As the battle intensified, the child's ship took hits, shields flickered, and sparks flew from the ship's systems. But the child didn't flinch, didn't panic. They calmly adjusted the ship's angle and speed, as if the damage was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. And in that same moment, they launched a counteroffensive with a move so precise that the enemy fleet was forced to retreat back into formation. Threx watched as the child manipulated the enemy into exactly the position they wanted them in, leading them into a trap that would ensure victory. This was no ordinary fight. This was a battle of wits, a game of maneuvering and positioning, and Threx could hardly keep up with the child's pace. Even in his advanced state of alertness, the human was already 2 steps ahead. Their ship continued to carve through the simulated enemy forces with ease and precision. The child's strategy unfolded like a brilliant work of art, and Threx found himself caught in a feeling he had not expected: admiration. This child was fighting not out of instinct alone, but out of a keen understanding of how war worked on a deep level. The simulation came to an end with the enemy fleet destroyed and the human child's ship standing victorious. But it was not just the victory that left Threx stunned, it was the manner in which it had been achieved. The child had not only survived the battle, they had conquered it with a level of intellect and foresight that left Threx questioning everything he thought he knew about humanity. The room fell silent. As the simulation faded, the child sat back in the chair, their expression unchanged, as if the battle had been nothing more than a simple task to complete. Yet Threx knew the truth: this child was no ordinary human. They were a warrior, and in that moment the Admiral realized humanity had something no other species had, something that could not be predicted or contained, something truly extraordinary. The simulation shifted once again. A new wave of enemies appeared on the horizon. This time, they were not mere ships, but a fleet designed to challenge even the most experienced captains. Threx felt a surge of anticipation. He had seen this kind of scenario before, fleets built to overwhelm and break down any defenses, but the child didn't flinch. They were calm and steady as they watched the approaching ships, the kind of calm that told Threx they knew exactly what to do. The human child was no longer merely reacting. They were anticipating each movement of the enemy ships with the cold precision of a master strategist. Threx could hardly believe what he was seeing. This child was seeing angles of attack that no one else would have noticed, using the terrain of the simulated battlefield to create opportunities for destruction. He could feel the tension rising within him. The child had done things in this battle that had surprised him time and time again. And now, as the enemy fleet closed in, he was watching something even more shocking. The child had begun to move their ship into the heart of the enemy formation. At first it seemed reckless. The ship was surrounded on all sides. The enemy was closing in fast, and Threx couldn't understand why the human child was doing this. No veteran commander would willingly put their ship in such a vulnerable position. But just as the first wave of enemy fire began to strike, the child's ship dipped sharply, weaving through the fire with ease. Then, in a sudden shift of tactics, the child activated the ship's cloaking systems, briefly disappearing from the enemy's sensors and reappearing behind them, catching them off guard, and firing a series of well-placed strikes that destroyed 2 of the enemy ships in a matter of seconds. Threx's eyes widened in shock. The child had used the most dangerous part of the battlefield to their advantage. But the battle wasn't over yet. As more enemies closed in, the child didn't retreat or try to find cover. Instead, they did the unexpected. They pushed forward like a lion, charging directly into a pack of wolves. Threx found himself standing on the edge of his seat as the human child expertly dodged the next round of attacks, the ship's shields flashing violently as they held against the barrage. And then, in a split second, the child fired back with the full force of their weapons destroying one enemy ship after another. Threx couldn't believe it. This child wasn't just surviving, they were taking command of the battlefield. The Admiral had been waiting for the inevitable moment when the child would make a mistake, but it never came. There was no panic, no hesitation, only cold calculation. The child had turned the tables, and with each move they made, Threx felt something he hadn't expected, a deep sense of respect for this human being, who was far more than just a child, but a warrior in their own right. As the last enemy ship fell silent, and the battlefield cleared, the child's ship remained standing untouched. Their victory was undeniable, but what struck Threx the most was how effortless it seemed. There was no celebration, no visible triumph. The child simply shut down the simulator, as though the battle had been just another task to complete. But Threx knew better. What he had just witnessed was something extraordinary. This human child had done what no one thought possible. They had conquered the battlefield with intelligent skill and courage far beyond their years. Threx stood in silence for a long moment as the realization hit him. Humanity was not to be underestimated, and this child was proof of that. Something within him shifted. He had expected to watch a game, and what he had seen was war in its purest form. The simulation shifted once more, the familiar hum of the ship's systems filling the room, but this time there was a weight to the air, a heaviness that settled over Threx as the child readied for the next wave. He had seen the child overcome everything thrown at them so far, but this time it was different. The enemy fleet was no longer a simple challenge. It was a mirror of his own species' strategies, a force designed to test even the most battle-hardened commanders. As the enemy ships appeared on the horizon, Threx knew the time for surprises was over. This was going to be the true test of the child's ability. The fleet before him was vast, a number of ships that could easily overwhelm anything in their path. Ships designed with tactics and strategies that mirrored the Xtal Dominion's own methods. Threx couldn't help but feel a rising unease. The Xtal were known for their cold, calculating approach to battle. They'd fought with precision and ruthlessness, and their strength lay in their ability to adapt to any situation. But the human child showed no signs of fear, no signs of hesitation. Instead, they studied the incoming enemy forces with a steely calm. Threx had seen such determination in the eyes of seasoned warriors, but not in someone so young. As the first volley of fire erupted from the enemy fleet, Threx prepared himself for the worst. But the child didn't flinch. They didn't retreat. Instead, they pushed forward, the ship weaving and darting through enemy fire in a way that left Threx speechless. Each movement was deliberate, a deadly dance that forced the enemy to chase the human child into the perfect position to strike back. The child's ship launched its own counteroffensive with a series of well-placed shots, taking down a few of the enemy ships before they even had a chance to respond. Threx watched as the child maneuvered with ease, dodging fire and retaliating with pinpoint accuracy. It was like watching a master at work. The Xtal fleet began to adjust their tactics as they realized that this human child was no ordinary target, but they were not prepared for what came next. The child's ship suddenly changed course, sharply veering toward the heart of the enemy formation, as if they were inviting the Xtal to come closer. The Xtal ships closed in, eager to eliminate the threat, but instead of falling into the trap, the child executed a move that left Threx reeling. The ship used its energy reserves to make a blind jump through hyperspace, reappearing behind the enemy fleet. In an instant, Threx's mind raced. He had never seen anything like it in all his years of service. The child had pulled off a move that even the best Xtal pilots would hesitate to attempt. The child's ship opened fire, immediately devastating the rear of the fleet and forcing the remaining ships into a disorganized retreat. Threx couldn't comprehend what he was witnessing. The Xtal were known for their coordination, their ability to strike as one, yet this child had turned their own strength against them, using the Xtal's overconfidence to their advantage. Threx had to admit it. The human child was outthinking and outmaneuvering them at every turn. The battle was no longer about technology or firepower. It was about intelligence and adaptability, something Threx knew his species valued, but had never seen so effectively executed by anyone else. As the simulation continued, Threx realized that the child wasn't just surviving anymore. They were rewriting the rules of the game, and with each passing moment, They were proving that humanity had the ability to rise above any challenge they were given. The child's victory was no longer a possibility, it was inevitable. As the enemy fleet retreated, Threx was left stunned by the events unfolding before him. The child had not only destroyed the enemy ships with unmatched precision, but they had done so in a way that made the X-Tal fleet appear disorganized and unprepared. It was as if the child had known every move the enemy was going to make before they even did it. Threx found himself studying the human child closely, not just their actions, but the calm focus in their eyes, the lack of panic or hesitation that had been present throughout the entire battle. It was something he had not expected, not from a child, and certainly not from a species so young in the galaxy. The Admiral had been observing humanity for some time now, and though he had always known they were unpredictable and full of potential, he had never seen anything like this. The child wasn't just reacting to the battle, they were controlling it with an uncanny understanding of how their enemies would behave. The child had broken down the X-Tal fleet strategy and turned it against them in ways that Threx knew only the most experienced commanders could manage. But this child was doing it with ease. It was as if they understood their enemies better than their enemies understood themselves. As the simulation progressed, the child didn't seem to be simply responding to the battlefield. They were studying it. Every move they made was calculated and measured. It was clear now that this wasn't just a battle of skill, but a battle of psychological mastery. The child was reading their opponents the way a master chess player reads the board. Every ship, every maneuver, was another piece in the puzzle that the child was slowly solving, and the X-Tal fleet had no idea what they were up against. Threx's thoughts began to shift. He had always been taught that strength was the key to victory, that the side with the most firepower would always come out on top, but this child was proving that intelligence and strategy could outmatch sheer strength. And it wasn't just the child's tactical genius that amazed Threx, it was their ability to predict and manipulate the psychological state of the enemy. The X-Tal fleet had been confident in their superiority, confident that they could crush any opponent who stood in their way. But the human child had shattered that confidence and forced the fleet into a state of disarray and fear. It was a kind of warfare Threx had never experienced before. It was mental as much as it was physical. The child's movements were no longer just about winning the battle. They were about breaking the enemy's spirit, making them doubt their own abilities, making them question whether they could even win. Threx had seen this before in the most ruthless of commanders who had the ability to dominate their opponents without firing a single shot. It was the mark of a true master of war. But to see it from a child was something entirely different. The Admiral could hardly fathom the power this child wielded, a power that went beyond just knowledge of tactics. It was a deep understanding of the human condition, the ability to exploit weaknesses not just in technology, but in the minds of those they fought. And just like that, the simulation took another turn. The X-Tal fleet was not retreating, but folding in on themselves, trying desperately to hold their formation together. But it was too late. The human child had broken them psychologically, and now the rest was inevitable. The atmosphere in the observation room grew tense as the simulation neared its final moments. Threx's mind raced. He had seen great warriors in his time across the galaxy, but what he was witnessing now was something altogether different. It was a demonstration of not only mastery over tactics and technology, but a raw understanding of the art of war itself. The child's ship had become a force of nature, its every movement flawless, and its every attack precise with deadly intent. It was no longer a battle between two fleets, it was a battle between minds, and the human child had already proven they were far beyond the X-Tal in that regard. Threx watched intently as the child continued to manipulate the battlefield with effortless grace. The X-Tal fleet, which had once been a formidable force, was now reduced to a chaotic collection of disorganized ships, scrambling to avoid annihilation. The child had not only shattered their confidence, but had outsmarted them at every turn. The remaining ships were desperately trying to retreat, but it was too late. The human child had already positioned their own fleet in the perfect place for the final strike. Threx had to admit it, there was no longer any contest. The child had won. But it wasn't just the victory that had impressed him, it was the manner in which it had been achieved. The child had used every trick in the book, and then some. They had exploited weaknesses that the Xtal fleet hadn't even known they had turned their enemy's strength into their greatest weakness, and in doing so they had broken them in a way that Threx had never thought possible. The child's ship opened fire once more, this time with a volley of shots that decimated the remaining Xtal ships. In a matter of moments, the final blow was struck, and the last of the enemy fleet was destroyed. The simulation ended abruptly, the battlefield disappearing, as the lights in the room flickered back to life. Threx stood motionless, his mind processing the sheer scale of what he had just witnessed. The child had won not just through power or firepower, but through intelligence, cunning, and a psychological warfare that had been so effective it had left the Xtal fleet in ruins. The human child sat back in their chair, seemingly unfazed by the battle that had just unfolded before them. They glanced over at the Admiral with a cool expression, their eyes showing nothing but quiet satisfaction, as if they had expected nothing less. Threx's heart pounded in his chest. This was no ordinary victory. It was a statement, it was a declaration that humanity was not just another species to be brushed aside in the galaxy. They were a force to be reckoned with, and the child in front of him was proof of that. For a moment, Threx found himself at a loss for words. He had spent his entire life fighting in wars, commanding fleets, and crushing his enemies, but he had never faced anything like this. Before, this human child had done what no one else could, and in doing so they had proven that humanity was not just a survivor in the galaxy, they were a master of war in their own right. And for the first time in his life, Threx felt the weight of true uncertainty, a question that would haunt him for the rest of his days. How many more of these children were out there? Threx stood still, his mind reeling, as the last of the enemy ships disappeared from the simulation screen. The child hadn't just defeated the fleet, they had broken it, dismantling its spirit, its confidence, and its will to fight. Threx had spent decades studying warfare, commanding armies, and overseeing countless battles, but never had he witnessed such a complete and overwhelming victory. It was as though the child had known every move, every weakness, and every strength of their enemies before they even made them. As the hum of the simulation chamber faded into silence, Threx turned his gaze back to the human child, sitting before him, their hands resting on the controls with a calm that was almost unsettling. There was no joy, no elation, just quiet focus, as if they were simply completing another task to add to a long list of accomplishments. Threx had expected them to celebrate their victory, to revel in their success. But there was nothing of the sort. The child's expression remained neutral as they powered down the simulator and slowly stood up, walking toward him without a single word. Threx blinked as the child approached them, their small form standing in front of him. Now he had expected the usual arrogance or pride that often accompanied victories like this. But instead, all he saw was calm confidence and unspoken understanding that the battle had been just another step in the journey to something greater. And then it hit him, the true depth of what he had just witnessed. The child wasn't fighting for glory or honor. They were fighting for something deeper, something more fundamental. It wasn't about winning the battle. It was about understanding the nature of the fight itself. The human child had seen through the Xtal fleet's tactics, the way an artist sees through the brushstrokes of a painting. And what they had done was turn that understanding into something far greater than just victory. They had demonstrated an insight into warfare that was unparalleled, an ability to manipulate and control the flow of battle in a way that no other species had shown. Threx realized then that it wasn't just their tactical brilliance that had impressed him, it was their ability to adapt, to think on a level that transcended the traditional concepts of combat. He had spent so many years assuming that strength in numbers, that raw firepower and advanced technology were the key to victory, but the human child had shown him that the true power lay in understanding the human spirit, the ability to endure and to fight in ways that others simply couldn't anticipate. Humanity's strength wasn't in their ships or their weapons, it was in their minds, their ability to outthink and outblast every challenge placed before them. As the child stood before him, Threx found himself at a loss for words. They were so small, so young, and yet so powerful in a way that made every instinct he had as a soldier seem insignificant in comparison. He had expected to see a fleeting flash of brilliance from a young mind, But what he had seen was something far greater. The human child was not just a prodigy, they were the embodiment of the human spirit, a force that could not be contained or predicted. In that moment, Threx understood something profound about humanity. They were not just survivors, they were conquerors in their own right, and this child had just proven that to him beyond any doubt. Threx stood silently, staring at the human child before him, the child's eyes locked on his without fear or hesitation. There was no arrogance, no triumph, only a quiet understanding, as if the child knew that this moment was more than just an end to a battle. It was the beginning of something far greater, something that would shift the balance of power in the galaxy forever. The Admiral had seen enough to know that the human race was no longer just a species to be considered on the fringe. They were something much more formidable than anyone could have imagined. The silence stretched on, but this time Threx didn't feel the usual pressure to break it. He was no longer the commanding officer of a vast fleet, no longer the hunter chasing after prey. He was now just a witness to something that would change the galaxy for good, and the child in front of him was the proof of that. The child had not only defeated the enemy fleet, but had dismantled the very concept of warfare that Threx had spent his life perfecting. He had believed that strength and superiority were the only ways to win, but the human child had shown him that intelligence, adaptability, and psychological warfare could shift the course of history. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Threx spoke, his voice calm yet filled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "You have proven your species worth, child," he said, his words measured but his tone filled with respect. "I had believed that only the strongest would survive in this galaxy. But now I see that strength comes in many forms. The human spirit is more resilient than I had ever imagined." The child simply nodded, acknowledging the Admiral's words without fanfare. They had not come to boast or to gloat, they had simply come to show what they were capable of. And in doing so, they had opened Threx's eyes to a new reality. The child's victory had not only shattered the illusion of invincibility that Threx had held for so long, it had shown him that the human race was a force that could not be ignored or underestimated. They were unpredictable, they were clever, they were determined, and most importantly, they were relentless. Threx felt a deep respect welling up within him for this human child, for all of humanity. He had spent his life commanding fleets and strategizing for war, but this child had shown him a new kind of strength, a strength that couldn't be measured by ships or weapons, but by the sheer will to persevere, to keep fighting even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And as he looked at the child standing before him, Threx knew that humanity had earned its place among the stars. There would be no easy path ahead for the human race, but with minds like this child's leading the way, Threx knew they would rise to any challenge that came their way. The future of the galaxy was uncertain, but one thing was clear: humanity was no longer a species on the sidelines. They were players in the game, and they were here to stay. As the child turned to leave the observation room, Threx stood there, a single thought echoing through his mind: the galaxy would never be the same again.